We might not be getting the Diddy Kong Island list, so instead, I'm making a list of 50 tips for set 15 for TFT, which will cover literally everything from champion, trait, and augment tips to beginner, intermediate, advanced, while also covering the set 15 mechanic of power-ups. We're going to be covering a lot of set-specific mechanics in this video, so unless you're already a TFT god, this is going to be a must-watch for like 99% of you. I've been playing TFT for over 6 years now, but one thing I've learned is that no matter how good you are at TFT from either new to the game, in which case you'll learn a lot from this video, or if you've played 1,000 games per set, I guarantee there's at least some tip in here that you did not actually know. So we're going to cover them in this order, starting with beginner tips, then power-ups, traits, champions, intermediate, then augments, and lastly, the advanced tips. But feel free to skip along to whichever section or order you want to watch it in yourself. But let's start off with the beginner tips, and the theme for the first two tips are going to be about positioning. Positioning has always been important in TFT, but it's a bit easier now thanks to the new role system. No, I'm not talking about role queue. I'm talking about how both your melee carries and tanks can live together in the front line. In the past, a lot of players had put their melee carries in the second row so that their tanks take the aggro, but now we can put them both in the front line because tanks literally take aggro now. It's part of their roles. But now we can put our units next to each other, and Jarvan, who is a tank, should be taking all the aggro, while Yone is allowed to do whatever he wants. I think this change is very good because now we don't have to do anything weird, and our units can start attacking right away. If you are lazy with positioning though, I will be updating on my website bunnymuffins.lol every single Friday with the best comps to play on the current patch, and I'll have positioning there for every single team comp. But now that we know that positioning is so important, how do we know what to position against? Well, one simple thing you can do is simply look at the right hand side of your screen, and you'll notice a couple of sword icons on a bunch of different players. Normally it's around 3. All you have to do is look at the sword icons on the right to check your possible matchups. You literally cannot play anyone else. That makes your scouting a lot easier and your positioning a lot easier because now you know exactly what you're facing. Next, let's talk about early game, which can be a bit tricky, but oftentimes we find ourselves in a situation where we have a 2-star traitless unit and we're wondering whether we should play that over something with the trait. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the answer is going to be it depends based on your augments, items, and game plan, but more often than not, it's better to put a 2-star traitless unit in the early game over 2 1-stars with the trait. Later on, you could always fix your team comp once you find some upgrades of better units or units that fit better with your team. But that brings us into our next tip, which is about team comps, which are quite varied. But one thing never changes, and that is needing resistance penetration and anti-heal. So pretty much in every single team comp you play in TFT for every single game, you want to make sure you always either have magic penetration or armor penetration. These effects are also called Shred and Sunder. You can get these resistance shredding effects from units like Kale, Lux, Kog'Maw, and Vi. You could get it through power-ups such as Corrosive or Sky Piercer. And then lastly, you could get it through items such as Last Whisper, Even Shroud, Ionic Spark, and Void Staff. I'd say items are the most consistent ones. Keep in mind, you only need to reduce the resistance of damage you actually deal. So if you have a full magic damage comp, you only need magic penetration, and if you have a full attack damage comp, you only need armor reduction. The next effect you need for every single team comp is going to be a burn and wound effect, or anti-heal as some people like to call it, and that is mainly gotten through Sunfire Cape, Red Buff, or Morello, but you could also get it through an augment or a power-up such as Inner Fire and Solar Breath. Speaking of items, you should almost always build an item if you have 4 or more item components on your item bench. We don't really have a time machine to move back to previous rounds, so every single round that passes by means that you've lost value on your item component. Pretty much close your eyes and dream that you are a landlord. Every month that goes by where you have a vacancy, you can't really just go back in time and have a tenant move in there, right? So you could essentially apply that same exact logic to items where every round where you don't build them, you lose some value, and that's not something that's good, right? So only deviate from this rule of building items if you have 4 or more components if you have a very unique game plan and are doing something very specific that's also tried and tested, or if you really know what you're doing. The next tip is also about items, and this is about balancing things out. So tanks are usually not as glamorous as a DPS or a carry unit, but tank items are just as important as carry items. You need to diversify. So if you have 2 carry items and 1 tank item, on average, it's often good to build another tank item instead of a 3rd carry item. Obviously, there are exceptions because you could balance your team comp out in different ways. For example, you could go for that 3rd carry item if you have like 4 tanks out and 2 DPS units. Then you have a good balance because you have 4 tanks out, with 1 item, and then you have 2 carry units with 3 items. But if you're running 3 tanks, 3 DPS, then it's probably going to be better to have 2 carry items and 2 tank items instead of going for a 3-in-1. But what do you do if you have an extra slot on your team this set? Luckily, there's a lot of options you have there, because we've all been in those situations where we have like a 3-5-7 trait, and we're at 3 of that trait right now, and we can't really quite make it to 5 because we're waiting on some extra units. What are you supposed to run in the meantime? Because you might have already filled out some of the complementary traits such as heavyweight or sniper, but adding 1 extra unit isn't really going to add any trait benefit for you. What are you supposed to run? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. It's going to be a mentor unit, because mentors buff your team. If only 1 mentor is on your team, all allies gain a bonus. So this could be an attack speed bonus, damage reduction, attack damage, and ability power, or bonus mana depending on who you run, Kabuko, Udyr, Yasuo, or Ryze. So they make perfect sense as kind of like an extra unit just to slot in. Then as you get deeper and deeper into the game, you definitely need to start thinking about legendary units such as Zyra or Seraphine. Zyra's pretty good because her traits don't really matter too much, and she also gives you an extra thorn that you could place on your battlefield. And then Seraphine's good because she can use pretty much any item because she scales off of pretty much every single stat. So if you just need someone to temporarily item hold something, she's going to be a solid option. And then lastly, Lee Sin has 3 different traits that he could choose. It's Juggernaut, Duelist, and Executioner. So if you're running any one of those, Lee Sin is going to be very easy to slot in. And of course, depending on the comp you're running, if they share a trait, odds are you do want to be running that random legendary. Speaking of traits, prismatic traits are a little bit different in set 15. So normally before in the past, to get to prismatic traits, you need 10 out of 10 of that trait. And that was only possible by getting like 3 emblems or something like that and getting level 10 and putting all the units in. Or you get like wandering trainers and you get specific emblems of your choice. But nowadays that interaction is removed. Now the only way to get to prismatic traits are by completing a hidden quest. For Star Guardians, you have to spend a lot of mana. For Battle Academia, you have to have a lot of items on your Battle Academy units. And for mech, you need to hit 3 specific augments and also field all 7 Mighty Mech champions. So it's pretty difficult to do, but if you get it, you should be winning the game. They've just been changing how that happens this set. So in the past, I've said a great beginner tip is to play specifically for vertical traits. Vertical meaning going very deep into one trait, such as like 7 or above. So if you go like 7 Star Guardian or something like that, that's normally what I recommend for beginner players. However, that tip is a little bit changed now because last set they actually nerfed a lot of the trait emblem augments, and augments are a great way to kind of get your team built up and kind of give direction for what you're gonna do if you're a bit new to the game. But because they nerfed these so much now, I don't know if I could actually recommend the strategy even for beginners. It's gonna be a little bit tricky. So I'd actually recommend avoiding chasing a lot of these deep trait comps until they buff the augments a little bit. Some other augments that are fun to play with are going to be hero augments, and they have a lot this set. We have Garen, Zac, Kennen, Malphite, Vi, Mundo, Shen, and Nico. And typically what these hero augments do is change the identity of a champion, normally from a tank to a damage dealer. They're really fun to play, but the only issue about them is that they could either be really, really good or really, really bad. There isn't too much in between. So what I recommend before you play them is always meet these requirements. So the first one is having additional copies of the champion. This is the most important part because the idea is to always 3-star these champions as soon as possible. So if you're not able to do that, it's going to be very tough to play them. So if you don't have additional copies of the champion, I don't really recommend going for them. And next is having item components for them. So you don't necessarily need to have a completed item right away. Let's just pretend like the best in slot for Garen is Sterix Gauge. I'm just saying that out loud. I'm not saying it is his best item, but if you have either a belt or a sword, you could consider going for Garen because you have some of the item components to make Sterix Gauge. You don't need to have the full item right away, you just need something that kind of aims in that direction. If you want like a Titan's Resolve on him, which is a popular item to combo with the Sterix Gauge, having like a bow or a chain vest helps a lot as well. But lastly, you have to also know how strong the comp is. Those are the 3 requirements. You need to have a lot of copies of them, you need to have an item component for them, and you need to know how strong the comp is. Luckily, the last one is very easy because I keep track of that for you. All you have to do is check out my tier list on my website, but I'm sure you already know the link to that. If you don't, let me know down in the comments below what it is because I forgot. Now let's talk about something a beginner should never ever do. So never go below 10 gold unless you are about to die. I'm I'm talking about in-game here. So whenever you're rolling, no matter what's happening, never ever go below 10 gold because it's so much harder to work your way back up. It's kind of like in real life. If you don't have money, it's hard to get money. So you never want to put yourself in a position where you have no money. So promise me one thing this set, only roll below 10 gold if you are on your very last life, because that's pretty much the only time you should do it. Otherwise, if you find yourself in a position where you roll down, you're at 10 gold, but you still need to roll more, just wait 1 or 2 rounds before you actually do another roll down, because you just really can't recover your econ once you go down past 10 gold. But those are the beginner tips. Let's move on into the power-ups. I have 4 of them here for you. So first things first, you should know that there are around 15 to 20 choices for each champion. There are essentially a lot of roles and trait related power-ups that are like specific to champions. So unlike anomalies, which people may have played with in the past, where pretty much any anomaly could happen for any champion, for power-ups, it's a little bit different. I'd say it's like the improved versions of anomaly, because someone's job at Riot Games, I'm sorry for not censoring that, is to go through every single champion and every single power-up and make sure that they're actually usable on them, which I love. So we have to respect that person's time and effort and know that most power-ups are going to be at least usable on every single champion, which I think is a great thing. One useful tip when playing around power-ups and re-rolling them is that you cannot see the same power-up twice in a row. So if you power up one of your units, the 3 selections you see will not show up if you remove your fruit and then put it back on them. They could show up in future options, but will never show up back to back. Another interesting thing to do with power-ups is that you could use them to solo the stage 1-4 neutral round, which is a pretty difficult fight, but there are a lot of weird combos to kind of do that. You're gonna have to do some experimenting on your own. But essentially what a lot of good players like to do on stage 1 is use one unit to solo the entire neutral round. That way they have a higher chance of making interest and essentially just snowball their econ for the rest of the game. And typically it's pretty hard to beat the 1-4 neutral round, but with power-ups, it definitely is more possible. By the way, I know people hate forcing a specific power-up, but there are other ways to actually use it, and I think only advanced players are going to do this. But sometimes you want to actually use your rerolls early and not save them for the late parts of the game, because if you're trying to lose streak and you get a little unlucky on your power-up choices for your primary carry, like maybe you got 3 support ones and you needed a damage one, it definitely is worth it to use your reroll early if you have a bunch of upgrades and good items to kind of force a win streak, because win streaking obviously is a great way to play the game. It's the easiest way to play the game. So do not be afraid to use your power-up rerolls early. Of course, there are other times where you do want to save it for the late game to get the best in slots on a 4 cost or 5 cost. But because they give you so many of these consumables, do not be afraid to use them early on. Also, you could always reroll a power-up by selling the unit, but obviously you can only do that so many times. Lastly, some comps are highly dependent on specific power-ups, so never ever use your power-up rerolls until you can use them on power-ups that actually enable your comps. For example, if you're playing fan service Xayah and Rakan, you absolutely need fan service, so save all your rerolls to try to go for that comp. Other examples are stuff like Artistic KO for Jhin, Colossal for Udyr, and many more, but those are just some examples to get you started and get an idea of what I'm trying to talk about. Next, I have 11 trait tips for you. Some of them are pretty funny, but number 7 I think is especially important because like you shouldn't do it in the first place, but the consequences can be even worse if you don't do it with this specific trait. But starting at number 1, we have Battle Academia, which enhances a unit's spell. So if you played the previous set where we had AMPs, where if you have more AMP units, you get more of the AMP stat, and then it kind of improves your ability. So if you threw 3 projectiles, you might throw 5 projectiles now. But Battle Academia works a bit differently than that. It's not just like a simple copy paste. What Battle Academia actually does is it actually enhances a spell rather than just making it fire more projectiles or making it a bit stronger. It actually gives it an added effect. So for example, for Rakan, normally if he doesn't have any Battle Academia active, he just heals and then deals magic damage to a bunch of enemies. But with the effect active, he actually heals the 2 lowest percent allies in addition to whatever he heals himself, so it's literally just an added effect. For Yuumi, her base ability is launching 15 pages, dealing a bunch of magic damage split amongst the target and enemies within a couple of hexes. But with Battle Academia active, every 5 pages, she actually launches a bonus page that deals a bunch of true damage, so it's definitely a more intricate way to enhance someone's abilities. Next up, we have Soul Fighters. Soul Fighters gain bonus health, attack damage, and ability power every single second of the fight, up to 8 stacks. At max stacks, they deal true damage. So one important thing to note about soul fighters is that you really need to make sure they survive those first 8 seconds. It might not seem like a lot, but if you're a melee unit, you will die out before that threshold is reached. So you have to kind of either protect your soul fighters or give them some type of durability with like an item, maybe like an Edge of Night on a melee carry, or maybe like a Hextech Gunblade in the backline just to make sure that they don't die randomly. That way they reach their full stacks and reach their full potential, and then you get a lot more power from the trait. Next up, we have one of the more fun traits to look at, which is Luchador. And these guys are funny because the units themselves don't need a Quicksilver because they have a self-cleanse at 50% HP. But if you are facing a lot of Luchadors, building a Quicksilver of your own is very good to have because it negates their CC that they're about to give your unit. So if you're playing them, don't build a Quicksilver. I mean, it probably isn't horrible, but it's kind of like a redundant effect. But if you're playing against them, it's a very useful item to have. We touched a little briefly on mentors before, but mentors should only be played if you can fit either 1 or 4 of them, because the trait cancels out if you only have 2 or 3 mentors. They're a great unit to splash in anywhere in your team, as you already know, but I do want to call out that you can break the rules of having 2 or 3 on your board if you have an augment called Teacher's Council, because this augment gives you their bonuses no matter what. After that, we have my favorite trait, which is the Crew. The Crew fundamentally changes how reroll leveling patterns work when you're playing this specific reroll comp. So in the past, I say, oh, never go above this level because the units that show up in your shop are very dependent on what level you are. So Crew works in a different way because if you meet one of the requirements, which is having 1 3-star crew unit, not only do you get bonus XP per reroll, but your crew unit odds never drop with player levels. So Malphite and Sivir are the 1-cost crew units. Normally I say reroll for 1 cost at level 4 or 5, but with this bonus active, you could be like level 7. As long as you have a 3-star crew unit, Malphite and Sivir will still show up in your shop the same as they would on lower player levels. So the Crew is a trait that is really good for both leveling up and rolling a lot, because your odds never get worse for specific units you actually want. So pretty much the tip here is to throw out all the reroll knowledge that you had from before if you are playing Crew. Next, we have our Edgelords. Edgelords get bonus attack speed when damaging units below 50% of their health. So while that bonus sounds nice as like a universal bonus, there are definitely ways to maximize this effect. So first things first, you want your units to focus on one target as much as possible. Oftentimes, if you're playing an area of effect comp, you don't really care about focus firing as much, but when you're playing Edgelords or like high single target damage, you definitely need to focus fire all your units so that you maximize a bonus, because let's say you have 4 DPS units and they're all hitting different things. The enemy units are gonna get below 50% health after like a long part of the fight. But if you focus fire, you'll reach that threshold much quicker and actually make use of the Edgelord bonus. So what you need to do is position all your Edgelords kind of in the same area, at least the ones with items, and that way they attack the same target and you get this bonus much more often. Let's move on into champions now though. Let's start off with Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa has infinite scaling, so make sure you play her early if you are committing to her as your primary carry. It works a little bit differently than previous sets because most of the time, the stacking units were mainly 1-cost units. I know there are some exceptions, but mainly they were 1-cost, and it's pretty easy to play those, right? You get a 2-star 1-cost, you get an item on them, and you just play them from the beginning of the game, and you don't really have too much trouble stacking them. The issue with Kai'Sa being a 2-cost is that you can't just start the game with a 2-star Kai'Sa. Like, I mean, yeah, maybe 1 out of 100 games you might get that, but in most games when you are forcing Kai'Sa, you're not going to meet the requirement of having her 2-star, having items on her, and having other 2-stars to win every fight. So the way to stack a 2-cost unit in TFT, starting from stage 2, is needing a good front line, such as 2-star 1-cost units, in addition to having Kai'Sa in your backline with an item. That way she gets a lot of kills, she gets a permanent AD stack, and you're able to still win fights. So oddly enough, it's very important to have units other than Kai'Sa be 2-star because she's just too hard to get. But if you do have a champion duplicator and you have 2 Kai'Sas, definitely don't be afraid to just Nico her or use a duplicator on her right away. That way you get the stacks going much earlier. Next we have K'Sante. So K'Sante is pretty cool because he has 2 health bars, so he ends up living like a really long time. That makes stacking items and augments on him work really well, so if you ever have something like a Titan's Resolve, it's going to be pretty good on him because you'll pretty much always reach full stacks. Another tank. Next, every set has some champion that does the same exact thing, and those are normally like the splashable 5 cost and the AoE CC or AoE stun 4 cost. In this set, those units are going to be Jarvan as a 4 cost CC unit and Zyra as a 5 cost flex. So Jarvan works in a lot of comps because, well, who doesn't want an AoE CC on their team? Like pretty much anyone wants that. You just put a Protector's Vow on him, he casts earlier, and then that's really all you care. You just need to cast once and hopefully your team can do the rest. Zyra's good because she is a 5 cost, she doesn't care about her traits that much, and she gives you an extra unit, which can be flexed as either a tank or a damage unit. So you can play her in pretty much every comp as well. We have a pretty funny interaction for the next one. So just like the CEO and HR lady, Xayah and Rakan are having an affair this set because this is actually their first set where they're both in it and they do not share a common trait. Normally they're pretty much always having some sort of trait that they could use between each other. So if you're the type of person who just normally just plays them together all the time because you just assume Riot Games made them have the same traits, you can't do that this set. So read their abilities, read their traits, make sure you're just not blindly playing them together. Next, let's talk about Gangplank, which is a pretty interesting champion this set because he's a 2 cost unit, but he also farms a lot of gold. If he uses his ability and the target dies, there's a 40% chance to gain 1 gold, and you can increase that amount if you give him ability power. So in the early to mid game, Gangplank can be a gold generating machine, but you don't actually necessarily have to play him all game. So Gangplank might be one of those units where in the stats, he's not performing so well, but he still could be very useful and played in a lot of your games because he can just be used early game to just farm a ton of gold. So you don't necessarily have to 3-star Gangplank, all you have to do is play him early and know when to pivot off of him, and don't get too greedy, you know, because at the end of the day, health total is what matters. Like gold is great because it helps save you health total in the future, but don't play Gangplank too much where you just die out and not win any rounds or not kill anything because your team's too weak. So the tip here is to play Gangplank early and often, but know that you have to ditch him at some point unless you're actually doing a reroll Gangplank comp. One of the more fun units in the set is going to be Seraphine, and the reason why is because she pretty much can build any item in the game. At least that's what Mortdog says, because her ability is Ultimate Friendship Bomb, and the passive of that ability is that the damage scales based on the power of friendship, which is based on all of your team's bonus stats, while stats on Seraphine herself contribute more. So it literally scales off of everything, which means that you could build any item on her. I think that's pretty cool because I don't think we've heard of a unit that could kind of do that. Maybe you want to build like Thieves Gloves on every champion when you play her. I have no idea, to be honest, but it could be fun to do. Let me know some ways to just maximize every single stat you can on her, because there definitely is some min-max there. Speaking of fun champions, Braum is a little bit different this time around because Braum is just not a tank anymore. You play Braum, you think of Braum, he has this giant shield, and you're like, yeah, he's a tank, right? But nope, for some reason, for the luchadors, Braum is one of them, and all of them like doing damage, you know? Like, you'd think Alistair would be one or something like that, right? But this set, it's gonna be Braum as a legendary for that trait, and instead of building Warmogs, Dragonclaw, and Bramble Vest, this set we're gonna be building things like Bloodthirster, Titan Resolve, Sterix Gauge, and all the melee damage items, like that's gonna be going on him. So that's gonna be a little bit different this set. You wanna give him all the AD and AD bruiser items, who knows, maybe even like Deathblade could be really good on him. By the way, if you wanna do some data checking, head on over to teamfight.lol and you can check out Braum's best items there. But normally for legendary units, Riot Games doesn't like doing like a solo identity for a lot of these units. So there are rarely times where there are multiple like pure tank 5 costs or like pure damage 5 costs. They normally have some like weird effect going on to kind of keep them a little bit more fun. And Braum is definitely a very good example of that in this set. Now let's go on into the intermediate tips. So these are gonna be, maybe you play a little bit each set, you already know how all the champions work, you have a good grasp on like leveling and econ, you watched my video on that already, and what's like the next thing you can do, or maybe things you didn't know. So the first thing you might not have known is Giant Slayer is now being changed where it's no longer a purely late game item. Giant Slayer is now what the name actually is. It's really good against tanks because you get bonus damage amplification against them. So what that means is with the new roll system, if a unit has the tank roll, Giant Slayer is going to be doing more damage against them. This means you are able to build Giant Slayer in the early game and not just save it for late game. Honestly, it's not that great early game still because damage amp isn't the best stat in the early game, but it's not horrible anymore like it used to be. Before, like whenever you had a sword and a bow, you pretty much never built this item because no one met the health threshold. But now with the changes, like everyone's always playing a tank, so there is always a use for this item. It just still might not be at like that great of a power until later parts of the game. But it definitely is something very useful to know. Now for actually improving. If you want to improve at TFT, you have to do more than simply just autopilot and play 500 games each set. Because I know a lot of people, they play a lot of games. There's one account I saw that was like platinum and 1,000 games played last set in set 14. I was just like, dang, how does that happen? Like, do they want to improve or do they not want to improve? I'm not actually really too sure. But if you do want to improve in the game, one thing you could do is during fights, don't just watch them for fun. What you should do is actually think about what you will do in your future turns. That way, you're not time pressed when you're doing a giant roll down, thinking about what comps to pivot to or what units to keep or sell. So during all downtimes, don't call it a downtime. We shouldn't even be using that term because the entire length of a TFT game, if you actually do want to get better, you have to use that to actually think about the game. So you have to be looking at your team, judging how your positioning's working, thinking about future turns, thinking about your bench, thinking about whether you should make econ or not. Always be doing something in the game because other people are going to be doing that. So if you don't do it, you're going to be put at a disadvantage. Of course, like we don't have to min-max everything. So if you just want to chill and play, like you definitely can still do that. So for those players, I will give you a bonus tip. When fights are happening in TFT, one way to get better is to just predict who is going to win each fight. And that way you get better at judging board strength based on people's traits, augments, star levels, and items. Now let's talk about slow rolling. So when slow rolling, one common mistake I see a lot of players make is they roll during a neutral round when they're 1 or 2 copies away from 3-starring a unit. So the reason you do not want to do this is because neutral rounds drop units and sometimes you do get the specific one that you want. So if you rolled and then see the unit from the drop, you essentially wasted gold. So pretty much always just wait during the neutral rounds before you slow roll, see what comes out of the loot orbs, and then if you get the unit you want, great, then you don't have to roll, and if you don't, just roll in the next turn. That way you save a little bit of gold in maybe 1 out of 20 games. I know it doesn't sound like much, but if you do this tip plus all the other tips that we've talked about already, if you improve a little bit for all these 1 out of 20 scenarios or even 1 out of 100 scenarios, over time it adds up to be a lot. And that's how you essentially climb, not only in this game, but any game that you want to play. My next tip, some people are going to hate because it's about scouting. I know people hate scouting, but if you do scout, and I do recommend scouting, whenever you see an opponent going for something crazy like a 3-star 4 cost or a 3-star 5 cost, you might think that you should always try to grief them. That definitely is an option, but only if you are in a position to do so. So what does that mean? Typically, this means that if you and the person going for the 3-star are both competing for top 2, then you should be the one griefing them. But if you're in a game and like the first place guy is going for 3-star whatever, and you're fighting for your life to get to top 6 or like top 4, and maybe you don't have too much gold because you already rolled down already, and you followed my beginner tip of never go below 10 gold unless you are on your last life, and you are on your last life right now, it's essentially not your job to grief units because you don't care who gets first, right? You're trying to just get top 6 or top 4 and get out. So if someone hits the 3-star 4 cost, that's essentially the fault of the players fighting for 2nd and 3rd place because those are the people who actually get affected by this. Like you do not care if someone gets a 3-star 4 cost if you're going for 6. So only grief if you're in a position to do so. Now let's talk about fast 8ing. So fast 8 is a very good strategy to use in a lot of situations, but I think people overplay it. So even if level 8 is the meta, you shouldn't force a fast 8 every single game because fast 8 requires 2 things. It requires both health and economy, and that doesn't happen every game. Like we get a lot of games where we get a lot of gold, but maybe not so much health, and we get a lot of games where we have a lot of health, but maybe not so much gold. For fast 8ing, you need both. So if you are low health and lose streaking, it can often be bait to go for fast 8. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but it can often be bait because it generally is better to look for a reroll comp instead when you're in that situation because it's much easier to hit and stabilize during stage 4 with a 3 cost comp or a 2 cost comp than it is with a 4 cost comp. How many times have we been in those situations where we roll down on level 8 and we hit the 1-star 4 cost that we want, but maybe we don't get one of the other copy that we need. So we get like the damage dealer but no tank, or we get the tank and no damage dealer, and then we're pretty screwed after that. So if you have low health, you get really punished because, well, your team just sucks. And even if you hit, whenever you face one of the super high rollers, you're gonna lose to them anyways, and then since you have no health, you're gonna end up dying anyways. On the flip side, if you go level 8 but you maybe only have 15 or 20 gold to roll with, but you have a lot of health. During your roll down, you're not going to hit too many units because you only have 15 or 20 gold. So there's a chance you see nothing you want at all, in which case Fast 8 was a complete waste of time for you. You probably should have just waited and leveled up to level 8 in maybe 1 or 2 rounds. So pretty much in order to do a fast whatever strategy, you need both health and econ, and a lot of players do it when they only have one of them. That way, if you roll down and hit, great. Even if you face the Giga High Roller, you still have health to play with later on in the game. And also, since you have a lot of money, you're likely to get some 2 stars, and you could also survive in case you miss and only have 1-star copies of your champions. Now comes the hard part, because this last intermediate tip is a bit tricky because it kind of breaks everything I've said so far in this video, and that is, don't be afraid to break the rules. You usually hear me say things like usually, often, typically, and the reason why I use those words is because nothing in TFT is that certain or absolute. Sometimes you need to break away from whatever the leveling guide told you to roll on or what not to roll on, and sometimes you need to do weird things. Obviously, you need to do it within reason, and you have to have some logical purpose for doing so. But learning how to break the rules and when to break the rules is essentially what's going to make you a much better player in the long run, because that's literally what being a better player is. You do those weird plays when you're supposed to, but for every other situation, you follow the book to a T. I will warn you though that when you do try to break the rules, you will do it a bit too many times, and you'll probably lose LP in the short term, but in the long term, it's definitely the best way to become a better player, because you'll be able to limit test every single situation and know how to min-max the game of TFT, which as you get higher and higher becomes more and more important. So if you want to push for like Challenger, Grandmaster, Master, or whatever is like 2 or 3 tiers higher than what you are currently, you have to start breaking the rules at least a little bit in order to see substantial improvement. But let's take a break from the intermediate tips. Let's go into a raid chat. I'm kidding. Let's go into the augments. Some of these are straightforward, some of them are a little bit tricky. The first one I want to cover is Deadlier Cap and Deadlier Blade. These two are stacking augments where they give you a Rabadon's Death Cap or a Death Blade, and they're both actually like quite interesting and quite good. But the only thing you need to do is make sure that you actually have a unit that can actually kill things and win early rounds, such as a 2-star unit. So you might just take this because you're like, oh, Death Blade's best in slot for the comp I want to play. And I'd say that's not enough to take this augment, because again, you need to stack it early and often, so you need a complementary unit to slam on the unit, maybe like an Infinity Edge or Rage Blade depending on what they do, and also have them 2-star and have 2-star tanks in front of them, because in order to kill units, you need to win rounds. And you can't do that with just having a 2-star damage dealer, you need to combine that with a tank. Bonus tip for these two augments is that you're not actually committed to keeping that stacking unit in the game, because the stacking actually happens on the item. So you essentially have like a super death blade or a super death cap that you can move around, so do not be afraid to switch your carries, use your item removers, sell the unit, or do whatever it takes to get the item off of them and put it on whoever you actually have on your team that can actually kill things. Next, let's talk about Golden Guillotine, which is an on-kill augment. So unlike takedown augments like the last one, for on-kill, you need to make sure that those units actually kill things, right? Because it's not enough just to get the assist. So make sure you only take this augment when you have executioners as your primary damage carries and damage dealers with items and upgrades on them. So it's not enough just to be like, oh, I'm splashing executioners in here, let me take Golden Guillotine. Or like, hey, I have some executioners, but I don't have like the good items for them. Like, no, you need to actually kill people with them. So don't just take this because it's fun to have an on-kill augment. Next up we have is Unceasing. Unceasing is great because you can create a super Juggernaut whenever an ally Juggernaut dies, because they get durability and they get a heal. But one fun thing to do with this, if you want to create a super Juggernaut, is to make sure all your weaker Juggernauts die before the one you actually want to 1v9 with. So you need to position in a way where you have all your units out. Let's say you want to do like a Vi carry, right? And maybe put her in the second row. Have everyone else take damage first, that way they die. You could even put your 1 cost all the way on the edge, that way they die first. And then you get a bunch of super tanks, with eventually Vi being the one that gets the most durability. You might need to switch this position up a little bit. Maybe you want Set to take the tanking afterwards. That way Vi doesn't get targeted second. But essentially, like, you could just sacrifice Neferi and Aatrox or whoever you don't care about. That way the rest of your units become a lot stronger. One thing that they added in set 15 that I really enjoy are the Destiny augments. And these Destiny augments give you a bunch of bonus gold, but give you a random augment for whatever tier you're playing. These are almost always good to take if you are a good player. Whenever I watch really high level players play, they take them around 90 to 95% of the time because the expected value on them is really, really high. A couple quick tips for that though. So if you're picking Silver Destiny, make sure you set up an AFK board on stage 2-1 just in case you get AFK. On stage 3-2, be careful of taking Silver and Gold Destiny because you can easily get Golemify, or the one that turns your whole team into a training dummy, or get something like Restart Mission. So make sure you can afford to get those augments when you take Silver Destiny. I'm not saying never take it on stage 3-2, but it's just stuff to look out for. The next augment I want to talk about is the Crown of Demacia item. So whenever you take Crown of Demacia, one really important thing to note about it is that when the item holder dies, you lose the fight immediately. So obviously in regular fights, it's easy to play around that. You put your unit in the back or something like that, you protect them. But one really important stage you need to be aware of whenever you take Crown of Demacia is the Wolf Camp. Because if you have a squishy backline carry with Crown of Demacia, the wolves can just easily jump to the back and kill you on stage 3-7. So you have to be extra careful around that and just put them up in the front, because if you lose your wolf camp loot, you are going to lose the game because you'll just be so far behind everyone else. Next, I want to talk about trait augments because I've always recommended going for trait augments in the previous sets, but it's a bit different now, and also not all trait augments are created equally. Most trait augments buff your entire team, and the more you play of that trait, the bigger advantage you get from using those trait augments. For example, preemptive protection, it buffs up your protectors and you want to run a lot of them because of that. For raid boss, this is the same thing but for bastions. And a lot of other examples, the more of that trait that you run, the better your augment pick is going to be. However, there are a few augments out there that actually benefit more when you run fewer amounts of a certain trait. For example, God's Eyes Open buffs up a soul fighter and repeats that buff throughout the round. If you have a lot of soul fighters, you're gonna end up buffing a lot of random units. But if you only play, let's say, 2 soul fighters or even just 1, that augment will continually buff that unit, so you can kind of tailor who gets that buff, which is a very, very powerful effect. A similar augment is gonna be Tiny Team, where you want to run 3 or fewer Star Guardians to get a big bonus, and running more of them kind of defeats the purpose of that augment. Next, Cloning Facility is a very popular augment in this new set because it's a decent combat augment, and the effect that it gives is that it duplicates a champion, but it works best in certain setups, and I'm going to tell you what that is right now. So the best champion to put this on are units that have secondary effects. So Cassante is probably one of the best users and best examples of this because he gives you 2 health bars due to his passive. So he himself has 2 health bars, but his clone does too. So you just get 2 free tanks for your team, which is pretty fair for a gold combat augment. In the early game, it's even more deadly. Speaking of early game, if you have someone like Gnar, he's actually pretty good with this buff too, because his ability has a passive effect that provides a buff. It's around 35% attack damage. However, if you don't have any of the units that I mentioned and you took Cloning Facility already, do not fear. Pretty much any champion can do okay on this if they're any bit tanky. You can't really itemize them, so someone with some utility effect, maybe like a stun, such as Jarvan, would be pretty useful on the cloning hex. And it usually isn't the end of the world if you're not min-maxing this augment, because eventually you will get something like a Cassante. And as a fun fact, there is a very similar power-up to Cloning Facility, and that is going to be Shadow Clone, and the same rules apply. If you have special effects on your units, Shadow Clone's going to be pretty good on them. For example, Sorcerers, they activate a Sorcerer damage instance whenever you kill a unit or get a takedown. So having a Shadow Clone copy of whoever your Sorcerer carry is going to be pretty useful because you get that little extra bonus effect. Another thing with Shadow Clone is that it copies the items unlike Cloning Facility, so item effects work really well, such as Blighting Jewel on Malzahar. Last up we have is Blood Rage, and Blood Rage says that your allies gain bonus damage amp increasing as they lose health, so this might just seem like a good generic augment to play. You're like, hey, I just need a random combat augment. This is the one that I see out of my choices, so okay, I'm just gonna take this one. Wrong. You pretty much have to trick it out a little bit to make maximum use of it. So it's really best on melee champions. Ranged champions typically don't take that much damage, so they don't really get the bonus until it's too late. So I would really only play Blood Rage if you have melee carries, because those are able to take a little bit of damage. Maybe they have Lifesteal to heal up a little bit. I know it kind of counteracts the effect, but they get the bonus damage amp for at least a little bit of the fight by dancing around the health thresholds. Another unit that could be interesting to use this with is maybe Cassante. Cassante does get low, but his first form isn't as damage heavy as his second form, So it does work a little bit oddly, but he pretty much always gets value from this, so it could be something interesting to kind of try. I'm not saying it's the best ever on him, it's definitely better on him in his second form, but he's someone that can be used to get guaranteed value off of this. Now let's get into the more advanced tips, and I want to talk about the order of operations you should do your big roll down turns, because a lot of people mess this up. So if you've ever played the game and you didn't have enough time to complete your turn in the allotted time slot, here's the best way to play out your big roll down turns, such as right as you hit level 8 or right as you hit level 9. So first you want to level up and roll. Maybe you have 30 gold to roll down with after your level, maybe you have 50 or even more, but whatever you do, that's the first thing you gotta do. Next, what you want to do is use your item and fruit removers, assuming you didn't sell the unit you have your items and fruits on from before. After that, you want to activate your fruit on the unit you want it on, and lastly, you want to add on your items. So the reason why you want to do this order of operations, or the PEMDAS of TFT, is because items can be put on mid-fight, but stuff like fruits and removers cannot be used mid-fight. So before the round starts, you want to do everything you can that you can't do during the fight. So again, that's going to be rolling because you can't change your champions. That's going to be using item and fruit removers. That's going to be putting on the fruit because you could get something like Shadow Clone where it only activates before the start of the fight. And then lastly, you're going to want to fix your items because you could do that anytime. Of course, you want to be able to do this every single game, and it won't always happen even if you do follow this order of operations, but it is the best way to do it. If you are lazy at positioning, you could just swap your units randomly at the end of a round, and that makes it so that people who are scouting you literally just have to 50-50 the matchup, because sometimes people want to be on the same side, sometimes people want to be on the opposite side. But if you're against sweaty players who scout a lot and outposition you all the time because you're slow, you could always just randomly swap your units. That way you're literally just coin flipping. The next tip is about bugs in TFT. I know a lot of people obsess about bugs. They're like, oh, this is bug, that's bug, don't play this, or like always play this. But it's really not that important to know about bugs. I think it's like overrated, because the best way to work around bugs is actually just to data check everything, because data aggregates everything and it essentially tells you the result of whatever interaction that is bugged or even not bugged. Because at the end of the day, what do we care about? We care about a unit's output in terms of damage, we care about their tankiness in terms of their health and all their other related stats. But the only time a bug is bad is if you either have like a 6.0 average placement or a 2.0 average placement. Everything else doesn't really change that much, you know? If something improves from a 4.0 to like a 3.8 from a bug, like that doesn't really mean that much. So you shouldn't really worry too much about bugs, just worry more about like average placements of certain units, traits, interactions, things like that, because they pretty much tell you everything you need to know without actually needing to know about the bug. At the end of the day, we just care about playing strong stuff. But one way to find bugs before they're even discovered is by going onto teamfight.lol, which is a TFT data site that I made. So if you want to support the channel and you want to get a lot of TFT data, definitely go ahead and check it out. The next tip is about best in slot items. So a lot of people are going to be data checking and they're like, oh, this is the best item. It has 3.7 instead of 3.8 compared to this other commonly built thing. But what you have to know about best in slot items and data in general is that your game that you're playing right now is different than whatever the data is saying, because the data doesn't know about your specific game. So if you have an augment or trait that heavily affects what your units do, the best build for that unit is going to change. For example, if you build Stridebreaker early on in the game, but you don't have a way to crit, you're pretty much wasting a big part of that item's effect, because Stridebreaker or Striker's Flail says that critical strikes grant 5% damage amp for 5 seconds, stacking up to 4 times. So if you don't have a lot of crit, it's pretty useless. So you need to build crit, even if the best in slot might say something else. Like you probably have to pivot your comp into some comp that could use that effect a bit better. Another example is if you have a unit that really likes building Deathblade, should you always build Deathblade? The answer is no, because what does Deathblade do? Deathblade gives you a lot of attack damage. But if you get a lot of attack damage from a power-up, you might want to prioritize building stuff like Damage Amp instead of a Deathblade. So you could build like Giant Slayer instead. That way you're able to make more use of the AD that you get from your power-up or your trait, whatever, because it essentially already filled the role that Deathblade is supposed to play. So obviously care about best in slots, definitely look up guides on best in slots, but always tailor it to your game. So if you really are trying to win a lot more, unfortunately, you do need to actually position every single round. I see a lot of players, they play like 500 games a set and they just AFK, they just don't do anything during turns that they don't have anything planned for, which like is okay, it is doable, it is passable, and there are a lot of players who can get away with that. But if you're actually trying to get better every single game and trying to win a lot, you need to position every single round. There's like no downside to do it. Essentially, if you don't need that time to roll or make items or do anything crazy on your board, you really should just be focusing on positioning based on the matchup trick we talked about in the beginner tips. So whenever you have nothing else to do, look around at other players, scout to see what they're playing, scout to see about positioning, and position your units differently every time, because once you get better and better after watching this whole video, you're going to be facing better players and more of them are going to be doing those sweaty things such as scouting every turn and positioning every single turn. And that's why you might always curse every now and then when you're like, oh my god, this guy got so lucky in the fight. Sometimes it's not luck because they just simply positioned for it because they knew you were too lazy to move everything. So the last tip we have is a bit more philosophical, and this one is to play with the end in mind. So if you're an advanced player, you play a lot of games maybe, or you made it through this whole video, like definitely if you did that already, type job application in the comments down below. But you have to ask yourself, what are you really getting out of playing this game? Some people play for fun, and I always encourage that. I play for fun too, but a lot of people play to get better or a higher rank, and then lastly, some people play because they have nothing better to do. You need to figure out what it is that's making you play TFT and use that to guide your end goal. So if your purpose is to get better at the game, you actually need to get better at it while you're spamming like 1,000 games per set. That means you need to self-reflect every game, you need to review what you did poorly, what you did well, and then try to apply that into your future games. If you're trying to play for fun, then maybe you want to experiment and play with things that you haven't really played with before and kind of treat TFT like a slot machine instead of going to the casino, right? Or however you get enjoyment from the game. I'm not here to decide that for you. But what I'm trying to say is, you need to decide what your goals are when you're playing the game, because that's gonna just improve your life, improve how you play TFT, and improve why you play TFT. But those are the 50 tips I have for you for set 15. I'm actually gonna be maybe making another one of these videos in the future. So if you do have some tips that you especially liked, let me know down in the comments. And also if you have any tips that were not mentioned in this video that you think would benefit other viewers as well. If you have any specific questions on TFT, I'll try to answer as many as I can, but I also am available in the Discord, link in the description below. But that's gonna be it for me today. Hopefully you all enjoyed this, and I'll see you all in the next video.